Hello, everyone who's joining us. Yes, I am here in the shul, and I know we're not supposed to be doing that, but I figured I could have some special dispensation, and I'll count on you not to tell anyone that I was here. More seriously, of course, we are asking people not to come into the shul, but this was our only opportunity to have a recording without Aiden and Tanya all over it. So I allowed myself to come in here just for a little bit and to record this. This is a little bit of Haggadah prep. All right, we're going to study the Haggadah over here. We've been studying in the evenings at 7 p.m. the last week or so, and we have a nice group. We've been going through some good stuff on the Haggadah, and because it's Zoom, I wasn't able to record it, so I figured that I would come in here and record this. This year, of course, we have this awful situation with coronavirus. Our own community, we're struggling with we're looking for a lot of salvation. So a few things. First of all, we can't prep in a normal Pesach way in shul together, so hopefully this recording will make up for some of that. Also, a lot of us are going to be in much smaller sedarim. We really ask people not to invite people over or go to someone else. So we're going to have much smaller seders, 1, 2, 3 people. So we need a little more to talk about, so the seder doesn't go that quickly. And I also want to connect in some way the Haggadah, what we're going to study, the seder, all of that with what's going on, this terrible situation with this coronavirus. Okay, so those are our goals here, and with that, I'm going to start over here. We're going to begin with Maggid. All right, there's a few sections before that, but we'll start with the Maggid section. And I'm going to use a commentary. It's called the Maseh Nisim Haggadah. It's written by someone known, Rabbi Rav Yaakov Loberbaum, who's a very well-known author, commentator. He wrote, his best-known book is called the Nesivos HaMishpat, which is a commentary on the laws of Choshen Mishpat, the financial laws. It's very widely used in yeshivot today, so it's a very popular commentary. And he also wrote the Chavos Das on the laws of Yoredeya, and he wrote the Torah's Gittin on the laws of divorce. And he wrote many other books, but those are sort of the most popular ones. He's known for being able to get at the core of a passage or an idea. He's able to analyze what the deeper meaning of that is through a very careful reading of the concept or the words. So we're going to use his Haggadah over here, and he uncovers a whole layer of the Haggadah that I think I had been unaware of, and is really helpful in making sense of it. His Haggadah is in conversation with the 2 earlier Haggadahs, written at the end of the medieval, early modern period. That is the Zevach Pesach Haggadah, which is the Abarbanel, Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, Isaac Abarbanel's commentary on the Haggadah, and the Maaseh Hashem, which is a commentary on the Haggadah. It's called the Maaseh Mitzrayim, but it's a part of a larger work by Rav Eliezer Ashkenazi. So we'll have some interesting conversation between these commentators here, and it will help us. Okay, let me begin by just articulating some of the broader themes that these commentators find in the Haggadah. And this, what I'm hoping to record right now, will go through the first 5 sections of the Maggid. So it's really the introduction. All right, what is it that the Haggadah what's the setup of Maggid? What does the author of the Haggadah want us to get out of the introduction? What are the tensions? What are the key concepts that he's dealing with that he's trying to bring to our attention in the preface or in the introduction to Maggid? So let's start with Rav Eliezer Ashkenazi. The broad theme that he sees in the Haggadah is that the Haggadah is not just a story, it's not just a history lesson, it's not just about our beginnings as a people, but the Haggadah has a core theological message, which is that what we're celebrating on Pesach and what we celebrate on the Seder night was the tremendous glorification of God's name, which happened during the Exodus. All right? In other words, because God took us out of Egypt in the dramatic way that he did, there was a tremendous publicity of God's might and God's power, and God's name was well known in the whole world at that time because of what he did. All right, and throughout all of our history, we've looked back to that moment as the moment when God defined how powerful and how mighty and how he runs the world, and that he is the Almighty, the creator of the universe, and the ruler of the universe. All right, now, the tension that we have with that is that nowadays we live in a time of exile. We're back in another exile. And we have a lot of difficulties going on. You know, we have the state of Israel has a lot of difficulties. The Jewish people have a lot of difficulties. There's a lot of personal difficulties. This year especially, we have this virus, so it's a really, really terrible time for us. You know, there's so much difficulty in the world that how can we just celebrate God's glory, God's tremendous name? All right, so that's the question that Rav Ashkenazi is trying to deal with, and we'll delve into that a bit more in a minute. Rav Loberbaum, the Masa Nisim, he sees a different lesson in the Haggadah, and also a key theme for us as Jews. The lesson that he sees in the Haggadah is likewise. It's not just a history lesson. It's not just about that God took us out of Egypt. All of that is important. But there's another key defining theme over here, which is that God took us out of Egypt to be his people, to give us a mission in the world, and that mission is the giving of the Torah, following halacha, following the mitzvot. Those are the things that define us as Jewish people and define our relationship with God. Okay, so he's going to trace that theme throughout the Haggadah. So given those two themes, I want to sort of follow along these two commentators as they go through these parallel approaches to the Haggadah, and explain some of the passages according to both of their readings. Okay, let's begin. The first section in the Maggid is a famous section, Halach Ma'anya. All right, it's composed of three parts. The first is we identify the matzah as the lach ma'anya, the bread of affliction, the bread of poverty, poor man's bread, which we ate in Egypt. All right, then we kol dich v'nyesi v'yechol. We then invite anyone who wants to come to our seders to join us. All right, we throw open our doors for any guests. And we end off, the third theme is that we pray, L'shana haba b'Arad Yisrael. We acknowledge that right now we're in exile, and we pray that next year we'll be redeemed. In the Messianic times, Mashiach will come, we'll be back in Israel, and we'll have the full redemption. All right, those are the three themes. Again, identifying matzah as poor man's bread we ate in Egypt, inviting any guests to our Seder, and hoping for future full redemption this year, and that we'll be in Israel for next year. So there's a number of key questions that jump out at you over here. First of all, why is this in Aramaic? Right, the whole Haggadah is in Hebrew. Why is this in Aramaic? The Masa Nisim points out a few other questions. Why do we only invite people on Pesach? Right, we don't have a formula to invite people on Sukkot or on Rosh Hashanah or Shabbos or any other holiday. So why specifically on Pesach? Third question, why are we inviting guests after Kiddush? Right, we start off with Kiddush, and the Maggid is already the fifth section of the Haggadah, so it's after Kiddush. So any guest who joins us now missed Kiddush. So why don't we invite people before Kiddush? The fourth question is that why do we identify the matzah of all things as poor man's bread? Right, matzah has a lot of names and symbolism. So why of all things do we identify it here as the poor man's bread that we ate in Egypt? And I'll add in another question that is not in any of these Haggadahs, but someone asked me this year, which is, should we be skipping this year? You know, this year, unfortunately, we're in isolation. We can't invite people. Certainly someone you don't know where they've been, you should not be inviting. So should we be skipping this opening section of the Haggadah this year? So the answer to that question is that we should not skip it, and the reason is as follows. Both Rav Ashkenazi and Rav Loberbaum explain that this invitation is not exactly a real invitation. All right, it's more of a statement. In other words, we're not actually thinking that someone's about to walk in and join us, but instead we're trying to make a statement. And we'll see what that statement is, but that would make sense of why, we don't open the doors, we don't walk out and say this, we say it in our homes and no one can hear us. But the point is that this isn't a real invitation. It's we're trying to make a statement about the holiday of Pesach. And what is that? So Let's start with the Rav Loberbaum, the Masa Nisim. He points out, right, this statement, this paragraph was not said in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, when we had a temple. Right, that's obvious because we pray to be in Israel next year. So this is an addition. This whole section was added after the destruction of the temple when we went into exile. So he explains the following, that the Haggadah is coming to answer a sort of fundamental question over here, which is, why are we celebrating Pesach and our freedom when we're back in exile? Right, he gives an example. He says, imagine someone was in prison and then they were freed, so they would celebrate. But imagine they were then thrown back in prison, right? You don't celebrate in prison the fact that you were freed once, because right now you're back in prison. So why are we celebrating our exodus from Egypt and our freedom from Egypt when we're back in exile? What are we celebrating when we're in the exile? All right, that's the question that the Maggid is coming to answer over here. And Rav Loberbaum explains that the reason we're celebrating is because we're trying to make a statement which is that since God redeemed us from Egypt once, we know, we are confident, we have a promise from him that he will redeem us again. So even though we're sitting in the exile right now, we are fully 100% confident that we are going to absolutely be fully redeemed again, and therefore we're able to celebrate. So that's what our celebration is. Our celebration is not just that we were redeemed once, but it's that we were redeemed in a way that created this relationship with God, that we are his people forevermore, we are his nation, and that means that we will certainly be redeemed once again, and that's our cause for celebration. All right, and that's how he explains everything that's going on over here. That's why we call the matzah poor man's bread. Right, because we used to eat matzah in Egypt also. That's what they used to feed their slaves in the olden days. It was cheap and it was filling. So we're saying that in Egypt we used to eat the matzah before we were redeemed. And now, even though we're in exile again and we're, so to speak, recreating that whole scene, we're eating the matzah again, and it looks like it's dire, but we still are celebrating because we know that the redemption is about to come. So we're sort of recreating the meal in Egypt, which while we were slaves, right before we were redeemed, to symbolize that we're going to be redeemed again. And that's why we invite guests, because when you really want to throw a big party, you don't celebrate by yourself, right? People don't do weddings by themselves or bar mitzvahs, or if you do a big celebration, you do it with other people. So we celebrate other people to say that it might look like this is not a holiday worth celebrating, but it is. And we're so confident about our future redemption that we want to celebrate in a big, splashy way. And so we invite people to our Seder. And that's why we only do it on Pesach. On Sukkot, on Rosh Hashanah, other holidays, we don't need to reiterate or make it clear that we're still celebrating. Because, of course, those are days that you celebrate. They don't need a reinforcing. But Pesach is a holiday which looks like maybe we shouldn't be celebrating it, and so we reinforce by inviting guests. And that's also why we invited them after Kiddush, because again, it's not a real invitation, it's more of a statement that we want people to celebrate with us, and so we can do it even after Kiddush. And again, like I said, we could do it this year also, because we're not expecting anyone to pop in and join us, but it's more a declaration that we're making. All right, and finally, that would explain why this passage is in Aramaic, because it's an indication that this is a passage that was added in the exile. Right after the Jews left Israel, the first language they spoke was Aramaic. So this is to symbolize that this is only a reflection of the exile. But if we were in Israel and we had the temple, then we would not be saying this passage. So that's why we differentiate by saying it in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. All right, so that's Rav Loberbaum's explanation. Rav Ashkenazi, he accepts this general framework, but his conclusion is the exact opposite. All right, and he accepts the whole idea that this is not a real invitation, that we're not really expecting anyone to join us. But why? What is the point of this declaration that we're inviting other people? All right, so while Rav Loberbaum said it was an indication of our happiness, Rav Ashkenazi actually sees it as the opposite, that it's an indication of our mourning, our sadness, the difficulty that we have. And that is because in the times of the temple, you actually couldn't invite people to your Seder. One of the laws of the Passover offering was that you had to slaughter it, the day of the Seder in the morning or in the afternoon. You had to slaughter it in a way which was, you already had everyone signed up. So you couldn't just have people join you later on that night. You couldn't just invite someone last minute to the Seder. Everyone had to be set, the day of, before the Seder. So how are we inviting people? So the answer is because we don't have a Passover offering anymore. In the temple times, you couldn't invite someone, but in exile, we are able to invite someone. So Rav Ashkenazi says that the reason why we have this invitation here is because we're almost mourning the destruction of the temple. And we say, unfortunately, we're so sad that in exile, we're able to invite people last minute, and we don't have to have it all set beforehand because we don't have the Passover sacrifice anymore. All right, so the opening paragraph over here is getting at this tension between how do we celebrate the Passover and this tremendous moment of God's revealing himself and his might to the world. How do we celebrate that when we're in the exile and we're suffering and God's name is not that revealed in the world? It's not that mighty. It's not that awesome. Things look sort of dark for the Jewish people. So how do we celebrate Pesach in this day and age? All right, so those are some thoughts on Halach Ma'anya. Again, two ways to read the declaration of this invitation. What we're trying to impart, is it happiness? Is it some element of sadness? But either way, this passage is put here in addition to just the technical parts, the introductory parts of it, but it's a thematic introduction. It brings up a lot of core philosophical issues, which are celebrating the Exodus and the redemption when we're back in exile is something. It's sort of an incongruous, or it doesn't fit all that well, and that's something to reflect on. All right, now let's continue over here with the Haggadah. All right, then we'll see how these themes develop a little bit, how the Haggadah develops them, and how these commentators develop them. Okay, the next passage over here is Manishtana. All right, I'm going to treat the next three passages together. The next passage is Manishtana, the four questions, very, very famous section. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the four questions are: why on this night do we eat matzah? Do we eat maror? Do we dip 2 times? And do we recline? All right, so we ask about those four rituals that we do and foods that we eat, which are different than other nights. After that, we have the Avadim Hayinu, which also is, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's a sort of very quick summary of the whole story of the Exodus. It says we were slaves in Egypt, and then God took us out. It says biyad chazakah, with a mighty hand. So God took us out not just in a weak way, but he took us out in a very powerful way. Then we say that if God hadn't taken us out, we would still be slaves there, even all these thousands of years later. And therefore, we have this obligation tonight that even if we already know the story, we have to tell the story, and we have to tell it at great length. All right, and the next section, the third section of this unit is Maseh B'Rebbe Eliezer. We have this story of these 5 great rabbis who were sitting at their Seder, and it's sort of a humorous story, but these were some of the greatest rabbis of the Mishnah, and they went on for so long that night that their students came in the morning, and they said, our teachers, the night's already over. It's time to pray the morning prayers. So it's sort of this humorous story, but it has a very serious point, which is that even these 5 rabbis, as great as they were, and they undoubtedly had studied this topic so many times before, even they spent all night going over every detail of the Exodus and every detail of this Seder. All right, so what is the continuity over here? How do we make sense of all this, and what's some of the deeper themes that emerge from these sections over here? So Rav Loberbaum, the Masa Nisim, he suggests the following reading, and again, this is in keeping with his theme, right? His theme is that on the Seder night, we celebrate not only leaving Egypt, but the special relationship that we formed with God to do the mitzvot and to follow his commandments. So Rav Loberbaum says that that's the point of the Manishtana. The Manishtana focuses our attention from the history and from the story, and it focuses our attention on the mitzvot, on the commandments of the night. All right, so the Manishtana asks about these 4 rituals. It's a way of saying that the key point of the Seder is not just the story, but it's the actual commandments. All right, and it's more than that. It's obviously we're focused on the commandments of the Seder night, but we're asking more broadly, what is the reason as Jews that we follow the commandments of the Torah? Why do we follow all these halachot, all of these laws that we have? Why? What is it? What's the reason as Jews that we follow that? And the answer comes from Avadim Hayinu, right? How is Avadim Hayinu an answer to the questions of the Manishtana? So Rav Loberbaum explains that the Avadim Hayinu is saying the following, that we used to be slaves to the Egyptians, and then God redeemed us. So since God redeemed us, we're now slaves of God. He didn't redeem us so that we could just do whatever we want, but he redeemed us in order that we would serve him, in order that we would follow his laws. So we went from being slaves to the lowly Pharaoh and doing his back-breaking, menial, hard labor, and we went to doing the highest type of form of service that a person could do, which is serving God. So that's the answer of the Avadim Hayinu in very brief. In other words, if you want to know the shortest answer, why as Jews do we follow the laws of the Torah? The answer is because now we're God's slaves. God is our new master because he freed us. All right, that's the short answer. Again, it's not to say that that's the only reason we follow the laws of the Torah, or even that that's the primary reason, but it's a sort of short, easy reason. All right, so if someone asks you, in one sentence, why do you follow the laws of the Torah? The answer is because we're slaves of God, and God saved us from Egypt. And he says that's why in Avadim Hayinu it makes this big deal that God saved us biyad chazaka, right? God took us out in a mighty, splashy, open, public, very miraculous way. Why did he do that? This is a question that I don't think I'd ever really thought about this, but it's a good question. Why does God have to take us out in this miraculous, powerful way? Why didn't he just put it in the Egyptians' heads to let us go one day, and that's it? We would have walked out. God can do whatever he wants. He could have, he could have brought a virus, and while the Egyptians were in their homes, the Jews could have left. Why did God need to bring the 10 plagues and to split the sea and do it in this sort of mighty, very open way? So Rav Loberbaum explains over here that it's the same idea that he's been pushing over here, that if we had just left, if we had just snuck out, then there wouldn't have been the same relationship built between us and God. It wouldn't have been made clear to the world that we are God's people and that we are here to do a mission to live our lives by the Torah. So God did it in a very open way. He made it very, very clear that it's not just that he's trying to get us out of Egypt, but it's much more than that. He is becoming our God, and we are his people, and therefore we now have this mission to follow the rules of the Torah. All right, so that's why we needed this open, very public, miraculous thing to happen, and that's the more specific answer to the Manishtana. Why do we do the rules of the Torah? Why do we have these 4 rituals tonight? Why do we have so many other rituals? The answer is because God redeemed us from Egypt, and not only did he redeem us in a hidden way, but in a very open way, meaning we are his people, and we have to now follow the Torah. And finally, that's what the story of the 5 rabbis is here to tell us. Because these were great rabbis. They didn't need to tell the story of the Exodus. They knew it. How long does it take to tell the story of the Exodus? An hour, maybe? So what were these rabbis discussing for hours and hours and hours and hours all night long? And the answer, the Masenissim says, Rabbi Loberbaum says, the answer is they were discussing all of the laws of the Torah and the reasons to keep them. They were going through what it means to be a Jew and what it means to follow the Torah and what it means to live a life based on halacha and the reasons for that and all the rationales for that. And that's what they spent their Seder night doing, and that's what we ideally, those are the themes that we ideally touch on in each of our Seders. All right, so that's his analysis of this. Again, the strength of his analysis, I think, is that it gives you a very important theme to think about. It doesn't miss the forest for the trees, but it also is very textually based. It's really a very strong reading of each line of the Haggadah over here. So, so he's really bringing out the message of the Haggadah by reading it carefully. Okay, let's just go to Rav Ashkenazi on these three passages for a moment. He has a different suggestion over here. All right, he says that the reason why God took us out in this mighty, outstretched, powerful, public way, and he didn't just have us sneak out or, leave one day. So he explains that it's the following. He says if we had just left, if the Egyptians had said to us, okay, guys, you can leave, so we always would have felt in a certain way inferior or embarrassed of them. All right, we would have felt in a certain sense like second-class citizens. That, they let us go, but it would have been embarrassing. We were slaves and they freed us, but the whole thing would have left like a bad taste. All right, and he says even more than that, we would have always been slaves, not physically, all right, we would have been free physically, but emotionally and mentally, we always would have had this certain slave mentality. Right? We would have thought like slaves, we would have felt like slaves in a certain way. So that's why we needed God to step in and to redeem us in this big, open, splashy way in order to change our whole mentality over here. In other words, no longer did we feel inferior. We felt proud. We felt like the people that God had stepped in and saved our lives. All right, he had redeemed us from Egypt. He had done these huge miracles, public miracles, and no longer did the Jews walk around with any inferiority complex or any slave mentality, but now we felt very, very proud about who we were. And he says that's what the Haggadah means when it says that we would have still been slaves in Egypt. He says it doesn't mean that we would have been physically slaves, because, empires come and go. Slaves, free themselves in other ways. It's unlikely that we would have still been physically slaves to the Egyptians. But what it means is that we would have still mentally been slaves. We would have emotionally been slaves, even thousands of years later. So because God redeemed us biyad chazakah in this open way, therefore we're no longer slaves to the Egyptians, not physically and not emotionally. All right, and he says that's why the Haggadah tells us that these great rabbis were discussing it all night. Because if we had left on our own, it would be something a little embarrassing. You wouldn't want to talk about it so much. It would be like a hidden skeleton. Better left unspoken about. But because God took us out in this tremendously miraculous way, and he redeemed us with these open miracles, so it's something we take pride in, and we want to talk about it, and if anything, we want it advertised, and that's why these rabbis were discussing it at such great length. So the story of the rabbis reinforces for us that God's redemption here on the Seder night was something that left us with this, tremendous good feeling about it. We were left feeling very mighty and strong and empowered by the way that God chose to do the redemption. Okay, let's just study one last section, and this is essentially the introduction, the introductory passages of the Haggadah, where the key opening themes are identified and discussed. All right, so let's see this last part of the introduction. This is Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. The fifth passage here quotes Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, one of the great rabbis of the Mishnah. And he makes the comment, he says, I'm like 70 years old. All right, what exactly that means, but he means that he had lived a good amount. And he says he never knew that you were supposed to say the Exodus, remember the Exodus from Egypt in the evenings. All right, he used to remember it in the morning. That's explicit in the Torah. The Torah says that we'll see it in a minute, that you must remember the Exodus every single morning. But it wasn't clear if that was also in the evenings. Until Ben Zoma came around, and Ben Zoma read the Torah very carefully. The Torah says, "L'man tizkor es yom tzescha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha." The Torah says that you should remember the day you left Egypt all the days of your life. So Ben Zoma said, well, it should say, remember the Exodus, the days of your life. What is all? What is kol? Kol yimei chayecha. There's an added word of the kol. So Ben Zoma said, the yimei chayecha hayamim, the days of your life means every day, every morning. And all the days of your life, kol yimei chayecha, means in the evening. So this extra word is adding the evening. All right, and that's what we do nowadays. If you come to our shul, if you daven in the morning and the evening, you'll see that in the morning and in the evening we mention the Exodus. Now, the Chachamim, the other rabbis, disagreed with Ben Zoma, and they said, no, you know what? You actually should not remember the Exodus at night. But so why is there an extra word in the Torah? What is the kol coming to add? So they say it's coming to add the Messianic days, the Messianic period. All right, so Yimei Chayecha is this time when we're in exile, and the Kol Yimei Chayecha is the days of the Mashiach, the days of the Messianic time. So we have a debate over here. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Ben Zoma, they interpret they read these passages as saying that you should remember the Exodus from Egypt every morning and every evening. And the other rabbis say, no, you only mention the Exodus every morning, but in the days of Mashiach and the Messianic times, we're also going to be remembering the Exodus from Egypt. All right, that's the debate. Now, there's a few very serious questions over here. Number one is, what does this have anything to do with the Seder? All right, this is a totally different commandment. There's a separate mitzvah to remember the Exodus every day. But there's another mitzvah, which we're doing at the Seder, to not just remember, but to tell at length the story of the Exodus on the Seder night. All right, so that's a separate mitzvah, that on the Seder night we expand upon the story of the Exodus, and every day and every evening we just mention it briefly. But what does this have to do with the Seder? All right, why are we quoting a passage which is an analysis of a totally separate mitzvah? Obviously they're related because they're both about the Exodus, but they are two different mitzvot. So why are we quoting this on the Seder night in our study of the Seder mitzvah to tell over the story of the Exodus? All right, question number two is, why are we quoting a position which we don't accept according to halacha? Right, the halacha is that you have to say it in the morning and the evening. So why are we quoting this position of the rabbis that you only have to say it in the morning when that is not the halacha? The halacha follows the first position. Why don't we just quote in brief the Mishnah, which says that you have to mention the Exodus in the morning and the evening, and that's it. So Rabbi Loberbaum gives us a very nice reading interpretation over here. And as is his way, he explains that the debate between Ben Zoma and the rabbis is not just about the technical detail of whether you have to remember the Exodus in the morning and the evening or just in the morning. But he says that this is actually a very important philosophical debate. All right, and he identifies the philosophical problem as follows. All right, which is that he gives an example. Let's say he says you have a family who adopts a child, and they raise this child as their own. They give the child everything. All right, they give them love, they give them food and shelter. They give them an education and clothing. They take care of them for years. For 20 years, they raise this child. And at the end of 20 years, they, for the kid's 21st birthday, they take the kid to Disney World. So he says, imagine this kid comes back and they just start talking all about how great these people are, their adopted parents are, that they took this kid to Disney World. So that's immature, right? We would look at the kid and we would say, these people, they saved you, they gave you life, they saved you from bouncing around from foster home to foster home. They gave you everything. They took care of you. They gave you health. They gave you an education. They gave you a future. They gave you everything. And all you can talk about, the only thing you're thanking them for, you have gratitude for, is taking you to Disney World? It's immature. So Rav Loberbaum says that why doesn't the same thing apply to the Seder night? Here God gives us everything. He gives us health. He gives us food. He gives us air. He gives us homes. He gives us everything. And all we thank him for is the Exodus? That's to ignore everything else. And it's not just the Exodus, it's miracles in general. When you see someone thanking God for all the miracles he does for them, that person is missing that God our whole routine are things that God gave us. We don't just thank God for occasional miracles, but everything we have is from God. Our whole lives, everything comes from God. So how can it be that we thank God for miracles or for the Exodus more specifically? What are we doing on the Seder night? So as you might expect, Rav Loberbaum says the point of the Seder night, as he's been saying throughout, is not just to celebrate the miracles of the Exodus, but it's to celebrate the relationship which was created between us and God, that we are his people, that we follow the Torah, and that's what we're really celebrating on that night, on the Seder night. So that is why we're able to talk about it, because we're not just focusing on the miracles and on the physical salvation, but we're focusing on the fact that God took us as his people, and that's something mature, that's something profound to celebrate. Now, when did that happen? So let's go to the night before they left Egypt, right? The night before they left, God comes through, he kills all the Egyptian firstborn, he saves the Jews. It's the Jewish firstborns. It's a night of tremendous miracles. So on that night, it was a miraculous night, but the Jews did not become God's people until the morning when they left, right? The night of, they were not God's people yet. That was the night of great miracles. And then in the morning right after that, they left Egypt, and then they became God's people. So the rabbis say you should only mention the Exodus in the mornings to drive home the point that we're only celebrating the fact that we are God's people. We're not celebrating the fact that God took us out of Egypt, because we're not celebrating the miracles. We're not celebrating, the 10 plagues. That's not what we celebrate. We celebrate the fact that we are God's people and that we are his nation. And that happened in the morning, and therefore you only remember the Exodus in the mornings, to reinforce that point. Ben Zoma, though, says no. Ben Zoma disagrees, and he says the whole process of the 10 plagues, everything that happened in Egypt, all of that was part of the relationship building between God and the Jewish people. All of that was what led us to be God's people. And so, says Ben Zoma, we remember the Exodus in the mornings, of course, because that's when we became God's people, but also in the evenings, because all of the miracles, the whole process of redemption here, is part of our becoming God's nation, and therefore we have to remember all of it as part of the Exodus, and therefore we remember it in the evenings too. All right, and that's why, says Rav Loberbaum, the Haggadah quotes it over here, because they were trying to say that on the Seder night we need to talk about not just the final moment when the Jews became God's people, but we need to talk about the whole process, all of the plagues, all of the miracles, everything. Even though in general we don't talk about miracles, but on the Seder night, all of those miracles and that whole process was all part of us becoming God's people. And therefore we have to remember all of it, and we have to talk about all of it. All right, so that's how he reads this as a philosophical teaching about the Seder night. Okay, let's just go to Rav Ashkenazi briefly, and then we'll sum up here. Rav Ashkenazi has an interesting reading. He says that when Ben Zoma says to remember the Exodus in the morning and in the evening, he doesn't mean morning and evening as we've been using it, like daytime and nighttime after sunset. But he means by nighttime, he means the exile. All right, exile is very often compared to nighttime. So Ben Zoma says that Rav Ashkenazi explains that when Ben Zoma says that we should remember the Exodus both in the mornings and in the evenings, he means both in good times, in times of redemption, when we have the temple, and in times of exile. All right, like the year we're in now, right? We're in exile, and we also have a very difficult year. We have this terrible virus, but still, we have to remember the exile. We have to remember the Exodus. And the rabbis, the Chachamim, disagree, and they say no. They say we only remember the Exodus in the daytimes. But in the nighttime, when it's exile, then we are not obligated to remember it. So the rabbis and Ben Zoma would be disagreeing about this whole issue we started the whole thing off with, about how do we remember the Exodus when we're back in exile. So there's a debate here. The rabbis say we don't, and Ben Zoma says we do. Now, Rav Loberbaum points out that the Talmud is very clear that this explanation is not not how the Talmud reads it. All right, it reads day and night as literally day and night. So I guess it's not clear whether Rav Ashkenazi means that as a halachic reading, or what's more likely, he probably means it as a more midrashic or homiletical type of reading, but not meaning the halacha is still a debate as to whether we read it in the day or the night, in the day or also in the night. But that's his midrashic reading, that nighttime here means exile. Okay, so that's the way these two commentators make sense, or that's some of their ideas on these first 5 sections, the introductory sections of the Maggid. Again, they go through at length. We just went through a good part of it, reading each section of the Haggadah. But there's sort of 3 philosophical themes that they really tease out of this opening section, and those are: how can we celebrate the Exodus when we're back in exile? Right? What are we celebrating when the Exodus from Egypt was not a permanent redemption? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is how does the Exodus define who we are as Jews, and the fact that we follow Jewish law, that we obey God's rules, and we study and live by the Torah? How is the Exodus the foundation for that whole aspect of our lives? And issue number 3 is how can we focus on the Exodus when God gives us so much else in our lives, that how can it be that we just focus on the Exodus and we don't talk about other things? And I'm just remembering now, there's a fourth, those are the 3 sort of headings, but they did get involved in a 4th issue over here, which is why did God redeem us so openly and in such a manifestly, miraculous way, when usually God chooses to operate in history in more hidden ways? So why, when it came to the Exodus, did God feel the need to do something so miraculous and so open and so powerful? What was the purpose? What purpose did that serve? All right, so that's some of their philosophical issues that they bring up. And some of the explanation of the continuity of the Haggadah. I will just add one sentence about our current situation. Of course, there's a lot of things going on. We have situations locally throughout the world. This virus is ravaging the world, our country, our communities. It's just a very, very difficult thing. And I think we can get some comfort in the fact that Rav Loberbaum and Rav Ashkenazi both suggest that at the very beginning of the Maggid, the author of the Haggadah focuses our attention that we don't always celebrate Pesach in the best of circumstances. This year we're having a difficult Pesach. There's certainly generations of Jews who had very, very difficult Pesachs. There were Jews who celebrated Pesach in concentration camps. There were Jews who celebrated Pesach in isolation from all sorts of murderous anti-Semites who wanted to kill them. Jews have celebrated Pesach in the most difficult of circumstances, and the author of the Haggadah is well aware of that. And he doesn't try to avoid that question. He doesn't hide from it, but he tries to address it head on. He tries to bring it right up and to say to us, this is a question it's worth reflecting on, and it's something we have to think about. And he tries to give us some answers over here into this opening part of the Maggid Haggadah. So as we're sitting at our Seders, and there'll probably be much fewer people, we might be worried about people, we might have other difficulties, but even so, when we get to the Seder, rather than saying we only have 2-3 people over here, so let's just do this quickly and go to bed, let's take our time, let's take the same amount of time we take in regular years. Let's try to gather the same amount of energy and happiness and joy to celebrate this Pesach, this Seder, the same way we do in all other years when everyone's roaming around freely and coming to visit, and we have large groups at our homes. Even so, let's sit down and spend a couple of hours and to go through all of these themes, God's might, God's taking us to be His people, all of the wonderful things that happened back in the day when God took us out of Egypt and are still with us, even in difficult times. All right, thank you all for joining us, for studying with us, and we'll hopefully put up more study sessions on the Haggadah so that people can be well prepared. All right, be well and stay healthy.